In this video, we're going to be talking about echinoderms. As always, when you watch, make sure you're taking notes, you're listening closely so you can answer questions, and recording any questions you have that aren't answered in the video. So this is phylum Echinodermata, or the echinoderms. You probably recognize some of the species: sand dollars, starfish. This is a sea cucumber in the center, and this is sea feathers down in the bottom. While to some of you they may seem familiar, they certainly seem foreign to a lot of us. They don't seem to resemble humans or any of the other animals we talked about very much. But what's interesting is they are, despite looking so foreign, they are some of the closest relatives to us. So let's explore that a little bit. So here's our animal cladogram. Notice the echinoderms right here. And as you notice, there's a couple things I'm hoping you're noticing. Number one, as part of being right here on our cladogram, that includes this clade. That clade, if you recall, is bilateral. So they have two main derived characters. The first of which is that they're triploblastic. That's easy enough to follow. But the second is that they have bilateral symmetry. Well, that certainly doesn't look bilateral. It looks radial. In fact, there's 5 planes that all go through the center that echinoderms have symmetry on. And so, how does that work? Well, it turns out that as larvae, they have bilateral symmetry, and then as they develop, they morph into having radial symmetry. You may also notice that right next to them on the cladogram are chordates, which include us and include other vertebrates. And even though we're so very, very different, what we have in common is that we are both deuterostomes. We express deuterostome development, meaning our mouth develops second and our anus develops first. So pushing upwards, up through from anus up to mouth as we develop. Let's take a look at some of the general characteristics of echinoderms. So as I mentioned, radial symmetry as adults, but larvae have bilateral symmetry. There's a larva with bilateral symmetry. One hypothesis says that they perhaps might have been sessile, and as they developed the need to move, they may have developed radial symmetry. As I mentioned, they're deuterostomes, so they're coelomates, and the blastopore develops from the anus first. And here's another similarity they have with us. They have an endoskeleton just like us. So everything else we've talked about either has had a hydrostatic skeleton, no skeleton at all, or an exoskeleton. They have an endoskeleton, so they have a calcium carbonate plate with a thin covering of skin, but there is a covering of skin. One cool thing they have is pedicellari. Those are teeny tiny pinchers on the surface of their skin, and those pinchers help them in feeding and also maintaining the skin. You may also notice that they have these little bumps here. If you've ever felt a starfish, or you will in class, those bumps are kind of like little spines, and so echinoderms translates to spiny skin, and we see that on most echinoderms. Let's take a minute and review. One of the most striking ways that echinoderms are different than many of the other animals we've spoken about is something called a water vascular system. So a water vascular system is a very specialized organ system that we only see in echinoderms. Basically, it's a network of water enclosed in a tube, and the water comes in through what we call a sieve plate. You'll see that very, very clearly when we dissect. So the water is drawn in, it's distributed through a ring canal that goes around this central disc, which is the central area, and then out through each spoke. It's used for a lot of different functions, and so we'll see that over and over again. I'll mention the water vascular system. So if we see how it works, so water comes in through this madrepore, right, or the sieve plate, down through the canal, and it's distributed through each one of these canals. Now this radial canal, at the end of it, has what we call an ampulla. And the ampulla basically is almost like the bulb of a pipette. And by contracting or not, it can control how much water is in the tube foot. And in doing so, it allows the muscles around the tube foot to control its movement of the tube foot. And so because of that, each tube foot can move independently of each other. And the starfish is able to have some pretty cool movement. The tube feet also have, some of them are specialized for a variety of other purposes too that we'll discuss. When we take a look, you can see how that water vascular system is at the heart of each arm. You'll also notice that each arm has digestive material. It also has reproductive structures. And so these echinoderms are much more complicated than than we really kind of expect when we first look at them. Let's take a look at some of their organ systems and how they function. So respiration as well as circulation, both are controlled through the water vascular system. So the membranes of the tube feet are very, very thin, and they allow diffusion of materials, both oxygen and carbon dioxide, as well as waste, all to diffuse in and out. Circulation occurs through the tube water vascular system as well. So they don't have a heart. They don't have any blood. They're circulating their materials through the water vascular system. Their response is very, very different than ours as well. They don't have a brain. They have sensory and motor neurons that are controlled by a centralized nerve disc, by ring in the nerve disc, but they lack a brain. Some of their tube feet, though, do, as I mentioned, have sensory input on them, sensory receptors on them. Let's take a minute and review. So echinoderm digestion is a little bit unusual as well. So first off, they vary. Quite a few of them are predators. However, we do have some that are scavengers or filter feeders. One of the unusual characteristics of the digestive tract is kind of upside down. We're used to having the mouth on top and the anus on the bottom. Theirs is actually reversed. So their mouth is on the bottom where their tube feet are. That way the tube feet can funnel food towards their mouth. And their anus is on top. Additionally, some of them, not all, but some have a very, very cool adaptation that they're able to extend their extend their stomach outside of their body and secrete digestive enzymes. They're not secreting digestive enzymes like fungi, though. It's actually it's actually from their stomach, and then their stomach will absorb the nutrients. Starfish, for example, that would eat clams that are really tightly held together would squeeze their stomach in there to secrete the digestive enzyme. So kind of a cool adaptation. As far as reproduction, they reproduce mostly sexually. When they do, however, they have external fertilization. However, you're probably familiar with the idea that starfish can regenerate. So as long as part of the central disc is intact, they're able to grow new organisms from each piece. Now, as I mentioned, they need that central disc, and that's really important because remember, in that central disc is their nerve canal. That's where their stomach is, and that's where their water vascular system is. So they need to have at least some of that intact to grow more. As I mentioned, as they reproduce, when they're larvae, they are bilaterally symmetrical, which means that they need to undergo a metamorphosis in order to get to their adult form, as many of the invertebrates we've talked about do. Let's take a minute and review. As we discuss echinoderm diversity, I want to point out that I don't expect you to know every class. What I do expect you to know is to be familiar with some examples besides the starfish, and a little bit about how they might be different. So we have, of course, sea stars. Those are the ones with 5 arms that you're probably most familiar with. They live in groups near rocky shorelines, and I got to tell you, it's really cool when you can walk along a pier and actually see these guys hanging on to the side. It's pretty nifty. We've also got brittle stars. Brittle stars, of course, look like stars, but their tube feet lack the suction ability, and of course they look a lot more brittle, the more feathery. Sea urchins and sand dollars you're probably familiar with, especially sand dollars if you've ever been to the beach where they have like seashell stores. They tend to be bottom feeders. And what's cool about them, the reason why we can find them at I have trouble saying that phrase, seashell stores, is because they have calcium carbonate endoskeletons, and that calcium carbonate survives after they die. And so we can have that nice skeleton, if you will, of them. Their tube feet come out through little tiny pores, so if you were to just go pick up a living one, you wouldn't necessarily see the tube feet. I don't recommend that because, of course, they can be poisonous. Sea lilies and feather stars are, as their name implies, much more feathery looking. We think they are also the oldest group to have evolved, and they are sessile for at least part of their life. And sea cucumbers, they look, as their name implies, like cucumbers. Their tube feet have modified tentacle shapes to them, and they have respiratory trees to help them breathe. And finally, sea daisies are newly discovered. We don't know much about them, but we do know that they are echinoderms. Once again, I really don't expect you to have all these, just some examples of other kinds of echinoderms besides starfish. Finally, let's talk about their ecological importance. There's a few reasons why we really care about them as human beings. So first off, some organisms eat them as food. They're important in the food chain. We also are able to use them for some pharmaceuticals, as pretty much all organisms that we discover. And the one group that I really want you to know as far as their ecological importance is sea urchins. So sea urchins are voracious when they eat kelp. They can very systematically chow through a whole bunch of kelp in a very quick matter of time. In doing so, it's part of it where they attach to sea floors. And so what's really important is their role in the ecosystem is that they're a primary consumer. They eat the kelp, which is our producer, and in order for them not to overeat the kelp, we need sea otters. Of course, sea otters populations have been struggling since people started to decide that they really like their fur. They've come back quite a bit, but without the sea otters eating the sea urchins chow down on the kelp, and basically the entire rocky shoreline ecosystem is disrupted. So sea urchins need to be kept in check by sea otters, so it's really important we have both. Let's take one more minute to review. That's it for our discussion of echinoderms. As always, make sure you jot down any questions or put them in the comment field.